Just a little disclaimer, I'm not really going to be talking about research that I've done particularly, other than the way it informs me, but I'd just like to begin with a little pepaha, and partly I'm appropriating things. So here you go. Ko rua pehu taku maunga, because I like to ski. Ko wakato toku awa, because I live here. Ko Zealandia toku waka, because my antecedents from my mother's side came on that ship in 1858. Ko Noeline ho. It's really lovely being able to talk to you today, and I thought that I would take a slightly different lens to today's topic, and partly it was inspired by conversations with a number of people, and I just thought I would try and think about this idea of learning spaces, and we get to teachers and learners eventually, but I want to talk about it in the idea of this concept of a transit lounge or a VIP club room. So what I want to do is actually raise a few provocations rather than have any answers. It's much nicer to have the questions than the answers. So I'm going to try and get us to think a little bit about the idea of learning spaces and how they feel. And I know Leon has talked about those ideas through that philosophical and theoretical lens, and Chris has talked about it from the perspectives of teachers inside various spaces. So it's kind of quite nice how these are coalesced in a very serendipitous and unplanned way. And looking at what appear to be apparent trends in the design of learning spaces, and then ending up at, where do teachers and learners, or teachers as learners and their learners fit in this. So first of all, a big shout out to Maori architects, particularly Tim, who's not here. He very foolishly decided he going to the US was a better idea than coming here. But Trent is over there, and someone who's pretending to be Tim sitting over here. So I've had a lot of conversations with Tim and Trent over a little while, and about the notion of space through their architectural lens, and it's got me thinking about the learning going on inside those from a different thing. And I thought I'd just start with this classroom. I grabbed this photograph from a blog of someone who was working in Haiti as in a volunteer capacity, and talking about the kind of ways in which they make learning happen with the tools and the resources they've got around them. And that also precipitated some thinking about the way in which we decide what our resources are and how we use them. But when you look at this particular building, it's got fabulous light and airflow, doesn't it? You could say that it's very responsive to its local environment, and certainly really good in a sustainable way of recycling materials. But it's a very traditional organisation and conception of what a classroom is, given the way in which the furniture is oriented. So again, this whole idea of a teaching and learning space can be very culturally predicated on understandings and where they've come from about what a learning space is. So I thought it might be time to have a tiny little history lesson, and we'll begin with colonial New Zealand. And one of the things that keeps me going down little rabbit holes when I look up stuff, you know how you go after the shiny toy? A bit like Alice. I came across this while I was looking for something else. And the bits in bold are the bits that I'd like to emphasise. And this classroom was built by a local builder. It was about 30 feet by 18, clad in weatherboard, plenty of wood around, a wooden floor, a door, a chimney for heating, windows, natural light, and sleeping places, a hostel on site, possibly a loft for the Māori students who slept over. And there was a locked chest for the children's European clothing, but I found this next bit interesting, when it was available, which is kind of slightly weird because I'm not sure what that refers to. Was it for the Māori students and whether or not they had any European clothing? And then there was stuff for the teacher, the desk and a chair for that purpose. And then there was a raised platform as well. So, and a partition put in place, which is quite interesting really, to divide the settler children from the Māori children and probably to reduce the spread of kutu. Just also kind of health and safety, okay? So again, we've got another example of what you do when you haven't got very much and you make a learning space fit the context you're in. Bless you. Native schools were really interesting because they were established a long time before any formal education for Pākehā kids. They had schools built that echoed cultural norms of building. So the one at the top, the Ruatahina School, that one there had the wooden palings vertically to kind of replicate or echo the way in which traditional whare were built. And the one at the bottom, you see you've got what is a good Western looking building with a gable roof, sash windows, and all of those. Imagine fitting all of those kids into that one-roomed building. Obviously different ages, so you've got vertical learning as well. A long time last century, when I was first at primary school, it was a one-room school with kids of different levels at primary school. This is very rural, I'm telling you. And so there were the little kids here right round to the big kids who were about to exit off to secondary school. So again, though, that same kind of vertical learning is not a new thing. Let's skip to the UK and post-World War II and some differences in design in primary schools. And most of the record seems to be about primary schools. This is, particularly in Hertfordshire, seemed to be a hotbed of change in terms of school design. The Burley Infant School, still existing, the buildings are still there. Again, doesn't that look very, very modern and the kinds of ways in which a school is being built to have that sort of entrance now? And the exposed, kind of almost industrial look to it. But Walner talks about the idea of a particular learning environment not determining teaching and learning, but can help or hinder. And I think that has also come through in what Leon has said and Chris as well. Again, the Meds seem to have been quite influential as architects in the post-war period in the UK as well. Because Franklin wrote an article about this couple. And again, these are my italics for the bits. A sequence of interlinked and distinctive teaching spaces which permitted a degree of isolation while remaining part of a larger whole. That's kind of quite resonating now with the kinds of spaces that have been built and the things, Chris, that you talked about. And again, the intention was not to supplant whole class teaching, but to supplement it with smaller independent working groups. So that's our breakout rooms. Med then argued that the educational need and character could be enhanced by the full vocabulary of lighting, colour, acoustics, materials and textures, which we've already heard somebody from the Ministry of Education talk about as being super important these days. So nothing has changed, has it? But it's the interesting bit about both handmade and industrialised items being part of the fabric of the school. Included was an example of the school's, one of the school's layout, and that the access to fresh air and daylight, these kind of health and safety things from a medical perspective, whereas educators had very little say, and it wasn't in the UK until after 44 that they appeared to have a voice in this. And I think that's a really important point for us to pick up on a bit later. So that we've got the scope for public sector architects and educationalists to collaborate on designs that acknowledged and facilitated child-centred practice. And from my point of view, what seems to have happened is that there's now a little break between those two groups that we might need to change. Now, I don't think I've ever been I've been around for a wee while, taught for 20 years in secondary schools in single-cell classrooms, and that's what they were. So, and I've never heard anybody before really talk about the nature of the space they were teaching in. So something has changed. So the buildings have changed, and we need to find out has learning. Now, 21st learning spaces, I think are my theme of the transit lounge. On the left we've got an actual learning space, and on the right an image of Changi Airport. Spot the difference. Both are quite large with really, it's kind of reminds me of a film noir, you know, with those that high angle shot, or that makes everything else look smaller because the space is so big vertically. Now these two are learning spaces as well, and you can see this change from what used to be rectangular with rectangular furniture and quite rigid furniture to something a lot more organic and circular and cuddlier, I suppose. So in one sense that's an awful lot more inviting for being able to sit and talk. I was talking with this is last century again, talking with a principal at one point in a boys' school, and he said one of the reasons that all of the seating outside for the boys was in single lines. It wasn't circular. It didn't invite boys to sit opposite each other, because boys like to sit beside each other and talk if they do, rather than face each other to talk. And that got me wondering about the gendered nature of the way in which some spaces are organised as well. So that might be something to think about when you're looking at, especially when we're talking adolescents here, rather than primary school kids. Now, the one on the left, to me, looks like not a transit lounge, but a Koru Club kind of a look, don't you think? But it's actually a classroom. And the one on the right is a bus that the kids have turned into a classroom. So it then begs the question of that bleeding of the lines between home and school and other spaces. Once you add in the ubiquity of Wi-Fi access and changing the nature of, is there a front to the room? you know, like that, unlike that school of Haiti, where the teacher was obviously going to be in the front because everyone was looking in one direction. And Chris, you talked about those configurations where the teachers were back to back and talking only to their own group. So again, the way in which the furniture is organised can have an effect. But this, on the bus, those kids have got their feet up and the laptops out and making themselves quite comfy. To me, it actually looks an awful lot more inviting than that other space. Mind you, I suppose having nobody in it makes a difference. This is the Learning Lab in Singapore. This is a school. Now, we've talked a lot before about a lot of glass, and we have very shiny spaces. I don't know what happens when you get a whole lot of kids and they streak their hands across everything. The cleaner must be really busy. But again, it looks, to me, that's like an airport. Anyone else think it feels like an airport? Because when we look at this, that's also an airport. And it really is an airport. And then we look at the front of this school, and it has that same kind of airporty feel to it. So there are huge influences on what seems to be being brought into teaching and learning spaces about what they might look like. Again, there's a lot of glass and very tall voids. So the vertical seems to have become quite important, which makes the people in it feel quite little, actually. This is, it could be a classroom, couldn't it? Actually. Because it has kind of a classroomy feel, but it's the Corrie Lounge at Lundy Airport. So again, you know, we have these kind of spaces that, I think, Chris, you talked about the spaces that were colour-coded, that people knew what to do inside them. But sometimes, when the colour codes are so muted, it's not necessarily going to be clear what it's for. But even people inside a choral club are likely to be learning inside them, even if that's not what they call it. So we need to also think about some design styles of schools in this country now. On the right-hand side, we have our famous Nelson block, those beautifully rigid two-storey or three-storey, usually two-storey designs, especially for secondary schools. And this was a screen grab of the ministry collection of classroom spaces that exist and how they could be turned into open learning environments, which is just messing with the walls, essentially. But it doesn't stop them being Nelson blocks and relatively rigid. When you compare that with that much more organic shape of Hobsonville Point. And you can see in Hobsonville Point, it's very clear where the traffic flow is through that central sinuous spine, and to the side is where the learning tends to happen in various configurations of breakout spaces. And the Nelson block, that's before it was going to be messed with, is still very much in that single space configuration. So what are some characteristics that seem to be coming through? And you know, you're going to have to decide whether or not the idea of transit lounges or single or VIP learning, VIP spaces has any validity whatsoever. But the new kinds of learning spaces appear to have a number of these features, often primary colours in both the furniture and the walls. Sometimes those colours are very strong and can be quite overpowering if there's too much in one space. The furniture has changed from being clunky, wooden, heavy, more or less fixed, to rounded, movable, light, and that you can put different bits together and possibly even just lie on the floor if you want to, or stack them out of the way. So things have become a lot more movable. Does that make them flexible? Whoops. Time for a break. We're not going to take a break. Is that your computer? Is it telling you to behave? Is it? Then there's an awful lot more glass than there ever used to be. And instead of it just being for windows, it's now for walls, or for those peekaboo spaces where a teacher might be in a workroom, but you've got these kind of spaces where you can keep an eye on the kids when you're in there, and they can see you. So you can't just have a wee zizz if you need it. Wide corridors seem to also be very common in new building spaces for schools. Sometimes they're sinuous as they are in Hudsonville Point, but sometimes they are just these wide corridors that give the effect of it being a bit like a mall. You know, you have these really wide spaces that people go through and maybe pop into various bits on this off to the side. But again, a corridor could either become a helpful thing or an overpowering impediment because it might be just too big to do anything with. Carpet squares. Now, we were talking with somebody else who's saying that in Europe they don't have carpet because it's something to do with air quality. So all the floors are lino or wood or something. So people never take their shoes off and they don't sit on the floor. And they don't have a thing called mat time in primary schools. So that appears to be a very Kiwi sort of a thing. I didn't know that before today. And then if the learning spaces change, does it matter? And it comes back to that question, have we as educators, those of us who are or have been educators, have ever spent so much time thinking about this, or wondering what it means, or trying to think about how to understand it, or its implications or effects? And I don't think there has been. Although in the 70s and 80s there were experiments in primary schools to do with open space learnings. But here's a little quote from somebody from Tampa in Florida who was talking about her own learning space and trying to understand what this was. Now, she was actually a librarian and was trying to make the library space a lot more conducive to kids lingering, hanging around and being able to do things in. And says for decades we've settled for concrete boxes. Here it'd be wooden boxes, wouldn't it? Little natural sunlight and fresh air. Desks arranged in rows because it's easy for the cleaner. Libraries of boxes with walls of books, but the space didn't encourage talking about the books. And that immobility of the space actually constrains what might happen in that space. So again, you know, a space of itself may be an empty box, it may be a vacuum, but it may also help or hinder what can possibly go on in it. And that even reminds me of having taught in a prefab. And I found out that the prefabs were designed to fit on the back of trucks and only take up a certain amount of space on the road. So they were designed for the size of the space on the truck. So they got plonked on school grounds and it was the same kind of sized prefab regardless of who the learners were going to be. So the same kind of space for 38-year-olds, 30,8-year-olds, would operate incredibly differently than if it was the same space for 30 16-year-old boys. The physical size is different, the leg space is different, and when you put chairs and desks in, you end up feeling like a sardine in a tin, as opposed to with the group of 8-year-olds possibly having room to move and possibly lie on the floor. So again, that whole idea of fitness for purpose can get perhaps lost in the pragmatics of a learning space design. And the 10 years of open plan design was critiqued by Cameron Robinson in '86, and this relates to the primary school experiments in New Zealand. And I think this also would resonate with Chris's work, that their impression was there are a large number of teachers trained to teach on their own in their single cell classroom, trying to use that same skill in buildings designed for a different pattern of organisation for teaching. And I think we're still faced with that same dilemma. And in conversation with Chris earlier, and he mentioned it too, it's a bit the same as what happened with the introduction of digital technologies. Suddenly schools were given, or teachers were given computers. There you go, it's all solved now, you've got the equipment. What was missing was the pedagogical understanding of why I would want to use it in my classroom, what I would want to use it for, how I would help learners learn with it, and how that might actually change the nature of the pedagogy in my classroom. And I think that is one of the missing links in the development of learning spaces. The Education Hub, I think, has picked up something that Woolner wrote about new learning spaces, about the rows of desks and what a teacher can and can't do in these spaces. So again, it comes back to what does the teacher know, what does the teacher think about the space that they have to teach in, and how does that affect what goes on in that space? Do they even notice that they're in a possibly different space and what that might mean? So it doesn't, while spatial design might not determine practice, because other things might get in the way, it sure as hell can help and hinder, can't it? One of the articles that I found quite interesting was this one about unlocking the potential of a learning space. And again, my italics in it. You can't just create new buildings or conversions with a completely new type of design and expect things to work automatically. They never do they? Because you have to then expect that everybody knows what you do about what it's for and how to use it. So cultural change is rather glacial, isn't it? And pedagogical change needs help in that process. And the biggest challenge is not, I don't think, just in the design of schools, but what it is that teachers need to understand what to do with them and what that means for their sense of identity as a teacher. If a teacher has never taught in anything other than their own classroom where they can shut the door and no one can see what they're doing, they will continue doing the same practice they've always done because for them that feels successful. And they might not notice whether it is or not for the learners. If you put that same teacher in a room that is configured really differently, two things could possibly happen. One, the students might freak out because suddenly it's really different as well, and therefore affect the teacher regressing to the knower. Or the teacher might want to think, oh, I can't cope with this space, I want to go back. That's worst case scenario. I supervised a master's dissertation a few years ago for a teacher who was in a school transitioning spaces. And he said he had set up in one of these big open spaces for a group of students, set up the furniture in groups and what have you, and he had to go out of the room to get something. When he came back, the kids had put the furniture back into a much more familiar and comfortable format that completely undid the intention of what he was aiming for. So kids need to understand what's going on in these spaces too, because they can help or hinder as well. This is one of my favourite photos. 1922. It's when St Stephen's used to be in Parnell. And I'm not sure if you can see, but you have to wonder, was this something that could have been called a modern learning space of its time? Because it's obviously a multi-purpose space. You have a lovely set of rifles along one side, obviously for outdoor pursuits and education outside the classroom. And if you moved the wooden furniture, you could turn it into a gym because you've got a bar, a climbing thing on the end, there is a trapeze, and I'm not sure if you can see it, there are rings as well. So again, you have a space that makes do with what you've got around here. You have a classroom that is built for multiple purposes. Would we call it flexible these days? I don't know, because the furniture must take some moving. And it must be quite uncomfortable to sit on those wooden forms for a long period of time, especially with nothing for your back. And it looks like it might be multi-level as well, because the boys seem to be of different sizes and heights. So it seems like the older boys have got their backs to us, and the younger ones seem to be further around the outside, which actually resonates with me in my fleeting memory of a primary school classroom in the South Island. So, the configuration of a space can affect the extent to which students can interact with each other and work in self-directed ways. Of course, that is predicated on what it is that a teacher can do to facilitate that. So an architectural space can influence the way people behave both consciously and subconsciously. And that's the same for teachers and students. And does the teaching and learning get signalled by the room? But if you're tone deaf to signals that a space affords, again, you know, what necessarily might change, because I think, Chris, you also talked about teachers who are tone deaf to the potential of the room. So the potential of a learning space might be there, but it could easily remain unrealised if the people in it have no idea what to do with it. Smith again talks about teacher and student behaviours and what you get used to. And when you have students who have only ever known and been taught in schools where they are taught to problem solve, be flexible with how they organise curriculum learning and use multiple disciplines to solve problems, they're not going to know that schooling's any different compared with those who have only ever known the traditional sort of education. And that's where most parents are. So a differently configured learning space is so foreign to them that they think that this can't be proper learning because it's not what I know. And so there's a whole community out there that needs to be helped to understand that just because a whole bunch of kids seem to be feral in the classroom doesn't mean to say that they are. And again, so there's a lot of work about public perceptions and parental perceptions. A really, really interesting webinar happened through Flans a little while ago with Brett Bly from Lancaster University. He's works mainly in the tertiary sphere about learning spaces. But he was really talking about these ideas about pedagogies of engagement the idea of being social connections for learning, and the idea of massification of learning. And you can start to see how some of those ideas are being felt and understood in the way learning spaces are being created here. So he suggests that pedagogies of engagement relate to opportunities for active learning, flexible, and inquiry. So flexible learning doesn't mean that the students are suddenly able to do backward flips or be in Cirque du Soleil and do funny things with their bodies. It's more about perhaps flexible thinking. It might be about using the opportunity of the room and the people in it to help that learning happen. The active learning is the ability to move in the room both physically and mentally to problem solve and problem create. And that whole idea of blurring between one kind of space and another so that learning becomes the seamless thing regardless of space is another more interesting kind of space that we haven't really explored either. But you certainly have bigger numbers, and there's certainly an awful lot more blended options between the here and now and the virtual. And these spaces can be important because we might learn in them, but it doesn't mean to say we're confined by them, and we can delineate our own space. So it can be a whole range of things, both together and individually. And new kinds of spaces can precipitate more informal things, a bit like the places to be. So again, those opportunities for being, teaching, learning can be a lot more fluid perhaps, but also greater opportunities for that relational practice and collaboration, physical and social, that we've also talked about, but also the need for separation as well as togetherness. So space, I guess, can be influential. It can act visibly on us and constrain or support or apply what is acceptable pedagogically. And that means the parents, the kids, as well as the teachers and as well as the leaders in the school. So I guess what we're getting to is some questions that might arise about space, about purposes, teacher dispositions and knowledge, ideas of openness, what that relates to, resources that might be appropriate for spaces, what learners expect of a space, and notions of agency and who's entitled to it. And I guess the lovely people from Moa took me up to the Gardens School a little bit further up north there, which is this extraordinarily creative primary school on 3 levels. And I just took these photographs of kids hard at learning. And you can see this is a long open space with kind of a central spine of kind of gantry walkways where you can see almost everything. But the kids are with or beside or near various teachers doing different kinds of learning together by themselves with teachers. And you can see that they use the space really comfortably. They really own these sorts of spaces. So, you know, you get the kids sprawled out on the floor because they can, and when you look down, you can still see kids busy at work. What noise is one of the things that is talked about is, oh, you know, these spaces are too big and they're noisy and stuff. This was full of kids, and you would never have known. And then we have some examples of Wright High School, which is another new school. These are secondary school kids, right? So they're a lot bigger. The spaces aren't necessarily that much bigger, and you can see how they fill them an awful lot more. But again, they are using the resources inside those rooms, both physical and virtual, to make their learning happen in different ways. And you can see the configurations of students might be close, might be separate, might be beside each other, or together for the same task, but not necessarily connecting with each other. Oh, we're doing it. Another, obviously wants you to have a rest, doesn't it?
Noeline.
Yep, I'm practically done. So, do we have a transit lounge feel? Wide thoroughfares are often talked about as being able to double as teaching spaces. But then if they're used as teaching spaces, how do people get through without interrupting? Nooks and crannies can offer teaching spaces, but they might be too small for the needs, especially when you have older students. And they can be largely undifferentiated. So, you know, when you think about going to the airport and you're just kind of going through, you might want to find a quiet space to plug your device in or read a book or something. So you go and look for the bits out on the margins. But you know you don't belong there because there's nothing that says that's you, that you belong there. Whereas if you have the idea of a kind of VIP club room, you feel like it's your space, that you belong there. We know there's been a big furore about those with Choreo Club membership, about them being too full of people. So obviously it's not special enough. But in a school space, we're talking about the identity of belonging, of feeling like you have ownership of the space, being able to put your stuff up on the wall, being able to linger and claim a space. And that sense of, you know, this is our space, we belong here, this is how we look after it, this is how we do things around here. And it becomes part and parcel of that identity of that student and that teacher in that space. So, I just want to end with these questions. Do we as educators get the spaces we need? Do students get the spaces they need? Who gets to decide? And where's the space for educators to have a voice in the planning processes to achieve quality learning environments? That's me.